We are live. Hello, everybody. I'm gonna give a little bit of preamble. And actually, one thing we've never done is we've actually never actually introduced any ourselves. Kind of assuming maybe I know at least one person here if you've joined, but maybe it'd be nice, especially as people sort of trickle in. I'd love to see Glenn. Thanks for joining so early. He was here a few minutes early. While I was putting chats out to the public chat that I thought was a private chat. So I appreciate he helped us out with that. But why don't we just do some quick introductions for once as people kind of trickle in and join. So I'm Steve. I'm co-founder, CEO of Builder. It's the company that employs us all. I made the Mitosis project, or the original version. We have many people working on it now. Hello, Glenn. Thanks for saying hi. And also the Builder platform. This we call it a visual CMS. And so solving the problem of CMSs where you're managing templates and fields and the chaos, we take a more component-driven approach. Plug in a component that allows you to drag and drop with your components, which is more for like your marketing team to produce pages, hit publish, and you don't have to be involved in wrestling with pixels and stuff like that. It's your stack. You control it. You can work on more interesting work. Anyway, let me kick over to Mishko. Want to introduce yourself? Who are you?
Are we going like clockwise?
We can popcorn it. I don't know. Mishko's on this side of me. So yeah.
Step one, unmute yourself.
Yes.
Hi, how's it going? I'm Mishko. I'm the CTO at Builder, and I'm known for this thing called Angular, and I'm an Angular JS, and I also had something to do with Karma, and now we're working on this thing called Quick and Party Town, and I think it's one of those things where it makes sites faster to load. I think the biggest problem we're facing as an industry is there's just way too much JavaScript, and it's just going to be getting worse and worse as we add more and more behavior to our sites. And so Quick and Party Town are ways of having less code of it. So I'm going to hand it off to Adam.
Yeah, I'm Adam Bradley. Previously worked at Ionic, worked on help create the Ionic framework. And that's how I got to know Mishko, through all Angular JS and Angular 2 and so on and so forth. And then I was lucky enough to work with Manu, who also joined the Ionic team back in the day. And Manu and I both worked on and created Stencil JS, which is still powers Ionic is widely used. So we had a lot of fun putting that together. And now I'm helping out this team.
Well, my name is Manu, and Adam already almost presented myself. I'm joining from Spain, but you'd never know. Like maybe next month I'm in a different place. So, and I've been building SDKs and libraries for all sorts of platforms for the last 10 years: native, iOS, web, and now before I was in Ionic framework, building the framework itself and Stencil, and now helping this amazing team build Quick.
Awesome.
Thanks
for introducing yourself. And also, anybody in the chat, please just throw an introduction in there. I'd love to see sort of who's joining, tell us about yourself, etc. But the topic today is workers, right? And the common theme here, I think, is because you might say, web worker and service worker, pretty related. It's another process that can run on the browser to do special things. And then you have edge workers, which are similar but different, right? The commonality here, of course, is getting JavaScript execution off of the main thread of the browser. You can listen to us talk forever about the performance penalty of that. Usually that's hydration, which is running a lot on that main thread for your website to be interactive. But more and more, as an ecosystem, everybody's trying to find more ways to get the JavaScript out. We still like to write in JavaScript, whether now we kind of think about writing servers or serverless or edge workers, which tend to use lighter weight runtimes like Dino, where now we have Bun and stuff like that, or Cloudflare has their own system. Or moving things like with Party Town to the web worker, or Adam brought up a fascinating point in our last stream about how you can run other web servers in the service worker, which is funny because I want to talk about that compared to web containers in a minute. But looking at the edge for a second, which is a hot topic, which, as many of us might know, the edge is just many servers around the world that can serve content geographically closer to the visitor, the requester, so the content can deliver faster. I think originally we saw CDNs come about to do a couple things, to provide that closeness, which really was just caching originally, as well as shielding our servers from too much load, right? You get that, what do they call it? The kiss of death, when you show up on Reddit or Hacker News and then people would all hit your server at once and it would crash because web servers were waiting to serve the same page one at a time, which was kind of ridiculous. So we added CDNs. Go ahead, Manu.
I remember this Raspberry Pi project, and it's like putting this Hacker News project. And it was like, let's see how long it lasted until they crashed, and it had like a counter for like 5 minutes or something like that. That was the project.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, things have evolved a lot since then, since the singular, one response per requester type of model. So CDNs, I think in the original days were really just based on the max age header. So you just say everyone sees the same page for 10 minutes, right? And when you update your site, it's always 10 minutes out of date. Your CMS updated, the website's not reflecting. Your marketing team might be confused. Why is it, or you have to be careful with things like product data, things that could be in stock or not, etc. And so one nice innovation that came in was stale while revalidate caching. And so the CDN would always spit from cache, but we can refresh in the background quite quickly. We're even still seeing some CDNs not adopting this yet, but it is a very effective strategy. Obviously, we have static sites as well, where you can just pre-produce all the static files and push them to the edge. But now we're also getting full-on edge compute, right? We're getting the ability to run any arbitrary business logic, JavaScript, other languages at the edge. And really, we're seeing sort of three main use cases come up around that. On one extreme is just running your entire application at the edge. So request comes in, let's say it's a quick application creates and sends the resulting page, one-to-one as needed, might involve caching based on your cache headers, etc. That can be great, but two problems that we're seeing with the existing landscape. One is a lot of people use React, and React is notoriously slow to render on the server, so that's a bit of a challenge. And the second one is your data is probably not at the edge. It's probably all the way back in some specific location in the world. So the end user is still waiting on round trips around the world to get your response. To circumvent that, we've seen people also use the edge for traffic splitting. So many people come to the homepage, but the edge just rewrites the request to say, this is homepage variation equals menswear shoppers or something. Or localization, variation equals a certain language, and then you could pull from cache. Different people see different things, but you're not running your entire application at the edge. And then I think we're exploring some other sort of new areas with various forms of edge computing, but I think for the most part, that's some of our common things. So I want to pause there because we'll get to service workers and web workers, but the first one I think is interesting is, and this might be a good question for Mono in particular, is like, okay, for quick applications, to be clear, you can statically generate them. So you can just pre-produce HTML, put it somewhere, you get all the same benefits. Or you could server-side render them, once per visitor or some caching in between. And I know, Mono, you did some really fascinating work to make sure as requests are coming in, the server render response can be fast. I'm curious sort of like, what approach did you take? Why did you take it? And just tell us more about sort of when you're, and just as a, sorry, rambling a bit, but just so you all know, we talk about quick a lot, but I want to be clear. We talk about it in the sense that this is us trying to do the sort of latest, greatest approach to these common problems. So please don't take this as marketing quick. We just want to talk about here's how we sell the technology and the choices we made and why. So please, Mono, take it off.
Yeah, in fact, some of the innovation, the one you're talking about, comes from like Solid. Solid kind of create this output for the server, right? I think here the interesting concept is that in the browser, right, you can just interact with the DOM API and you can just naturally render the DOM, right? Render HTML. In the server, you have several options. One of them is trying to simulate a DOM, right? So you have some DOM library like Domino or GSDOM, and then you interact with that API, so you can kind of keep your logic the same, right? So your logic of the runtime will just interact with this kind of fake DOM, and at some point you just serialize, right? And all this, and you can imagine this comes a bit overhead, right? You have to have a pretty much big DOM implementation in the browser that is not native. So one of the approaches that that we are pursuing for quick, or for like, I think like any edge-friendly framework needs to have, is have kind of this string concat approach, right? And I think this also connects a lot with frameworks using GSX, because the interesting thing about the GSX syntax is that it's only syntax, right? It's not semantic, right? Like GSX, people talk about GSX and how this is VDOM, but that's not true. Like GSX is just a way to describe a tree, right? And then you can transform it, you can interpret it in many different ways. So one of the latest work in progress PR is taking this GSX and at the compiler level, transform it into a different output, right? That is mostly detecting the part of the JSX that are static. So if you have a piece of JSX that doesn't have any binding to data, it will be just one flat string, no runtime, pretty much nothing, right? And when it detects bindings, then it generates something else that the typical VDOM hyperscript thing. And the thing is that at the end of the day, you execute this and it's just string concatenation and pretty much no runtime and you're out, right? And I think this is especially important for executing all this in the edge, right? Like you cannot, especially because in some edge you have very limited runtime limit. Like you cannot even zip higher than 5 megabytes executable. So if you're zipping GSDOM, you're going to have a very bad time.
Yes. Adam, you unmuted. You want to jump in?
Yeah, and nothing else. You brought up like you could either use static or you can do SSR. I think what's cool is kind of this next generation of that the frameworks can be doing, including Quick, is that you can do both, right? What if we wanted to have all of our content, all of our docs site under the same domain to respond with the index HTML that's already been pre-generated? So absolutely no work done on the edge at all. It's just sitting there ready to be served. But then let's say like anything under /dashboard would be a dynamic page. And so we've gotten now with the edge, we've gotten to, the tech that's out there now. It's like we can kind of decide, the exact same build, everything can be identical. We want to constantly regenerate this one, whatever, and that can follow normal, cache header response, things like that. But then also this whole chunk over here or this whole directory can just be static. Let's just build it ahead of time and never worry about it again. So I think that's also like something that we'll be going more towards where really everyone's going to be doing more of.
And the other aspect is streaming, right? Some of the problem is that you need to run through everything, right? Totally generate this big string, which is going to be the final HTML. And when you have it, you send the first byte to the network. And while some frameworks, including React, like React has a library, right? It supports streaming, right? But when you integrate with things like Emotion, and I've been playing with the API, and Emotion doesn't support it right now. So pretty much everyone uses this kind of like CSS in JavaScript libraries, because they literally have to get a snap of the HTML and inject some styles at the top. So you actually have to know it all to put something in the top. So you cannot do streaming almost by design, right? Because you cannot put the styles at the end. Like if you put the styles at the end, then it will, what's the name of the flickering? This is a name, but it will flicker the website, right?
Yeah.
Flash event style content, fuck, or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that one. And I think like also new frameworks are realizing the problem. This is not something that it can be solved outside the framework. It has to be think about it from the ground up, right? And that's also something that we are taking into account.
Yeah, and I think the other like really challenging one that traditional React frameworks are hitting right now is that like the metadata, the stuff that goes into the head. If you think about streaming and how that happens, it's the first words that are being streamed. And so like you have to know the product title to go into the head of the document to continue to start to stream, but you can't get the head title information until you render React component. And so like React Helmet has this issue, and you see like, React Helmet, how you do SSR with that. It's like, well, you have to render the string and then we'll replace it and update it. So it's like, basically you need to render everything to then begin to stream, which is already too late. So you might as well just render the string. And so that's something that we're trying to address. And I think Remix does a good job of this. SvelteKit does a good job of this, where they kind of load the data beforehand so that you can create a good like 404 response or a 301 redirect immediately. Because that's kind of the first thing you need to know. Like you can't render the whole document and then know to do something. And so I like this next generation has thought about this information.
Yeah, and did we find yes, sorry, Glenn put a funny comment in the chat, and I actually don't want to repeat it because it'll sound like a bad word, so I'll let anybody see in the chat see it. But so here's a funny thing too. So what's interesting about, Quick is all about taking the resumability approach, but also about like just taking the sort of best practices of the sort of newer generation of the technology landscape and sort of framework landscape. I was at a Solid.js meetup last night, which was great. Huge shout out to Ryan and Dave who threw it. But they were talking about, we're all kind of sensing this lifetime of React taking a dip. Now there's lots of jobs out there for React and this and that, but just all these constraints. I remember the first time I came from handlebars on Node.js to serve pages, which compiles out to just a big set of strings that concatenate into one. Like it's just string literal plus variable plus string literal. And it was wildly fast. Adopted React. And I remember just thinking, because the narrative at the time was React is fast. So I remember like, oh, React is fast. And I would time the server, how long it took the server to produce the page, and was like, it would be a couple milliseconds for handlebars, and it would be a much longer time for React. And then, you look at, well, what's it doing? It's creating this giant JSON object, and then it's iterating over the entire thing to construct a string. And there's many, many added steps here. And that's really not as optimal as just becoming strings. And so, again, credit to Ryan on Solid.js, who was like, hey, we can just compile Solid JSX to just be concatenated strings as well. But I'm curious, so Miško, would you say that our approaches that we're exploring with sort of fast rendering from the edge, how does it apply to resumability? Meaning, the whole idea from Quick is you get HTML very, very fast, and then we can pull in anything else only as needed. We're not being over eager. Would you say that the new streaming and edge worker rendering approaches are, in a sense, irrelevant to resumability? That's just a good thing we baked in the framework that resumability supports. Do you think there's any specific aspect of resumability that comes into play here? What are your thoughts on this and the fundamentals of Quick, and then just, how this framework's evolving and how we can send responses so fast?
Yeah. It's a very complicated question. But we say that Quick is edge kind of in mind. And I think what we mean by that is that you could design a framework that, for example, would require that the server would run every single time a request comes in, right? And such a framework wouldn't really be friendly towards edge because, you have to have compute resources running all the time. So you really want to have a framework designed in a way where you can cache the intermediate value, right? So maybe, yes, we want to be, we want to generate different content for every single person, but maybe they can be grouped into categories, right? Maybe there's women's clothing and men's clothing. And so really they're just like several different categories, and we just want to respond with every single one. And so we shouldn't have to run all of this code on a server every single time. And we should be able to just respond with it. And so resumability is specifically designed so that this is true, right? It doesn't differentiate whether something came out of the server or whether it came out of a cached response. And I think this is a very, very important property, because if resumability would require that you would render every single time, you would have a very hard time, right? Your server bill would just go through the roof. And so you do want to be in a situation where you can create content dynamically if you need to, but you can also respond with the content. Now, there's another way to slice this, and that is that not everything on a page is changeable, right? Like your username changes, your shopping cart changes, maybe the hero image is like in several different categories, maybe the featured product is in several different categories, and maybe the number of possible interactions between them is like huge, right? Like if you multiply all the possible number of shopping cart items you can have, the number of hero images you have, and the number of products you have, like you get some ridiculous matrix that you can't possibly support. But the nice thing about resumability is that you can subdivide it to a section of the page, and you can say like, well, this section of the page is one of 7 different things, and this section of the page is one of 10 different things, and this section is one of like n different things. And so you're not getting the multiplicative effect of the matrix, right? You're just saying like, okay, I can pre-cache all these things, I can put it together into a response and reply. And I think this is going to be an area where personalization has to come in, right? Like if you look at a site like Amazon, it would be prohibitive to be like, oh, this is Miško coming in on the shopping cart, right? Like, let me render the shopping cart. And because I'm rendering now, I have to render everything on a page, right? And it'll be super prohibitive. Instead, what you want to have is a situation where like, oh, we know we have to render your username, and we also have to render the number of items in the shopping cart. But maybe instead of rendering the whole page, we can just like insert pre-rendered chunks over here. And so you should think about it not as a single page that either has to be rendered or cached, but rather as chunks of pages where each of the chunk can become either from a rendering source or from a pre-cached source. And if you look at it in that particular way, then all kinds of possibilities on personalization open up, which I think today we kind of don't have good answers for. Anyways, it was a big ramble. Hopefully, that covered it.
I think, like, connected to what you said, hydration is also a destructive approach in terms of the HTML, right? If you have the JavaScript run, you need some HTML. At some point, you decide to do a find replace, which might be enough for some use cases, right? Then, when the application actually becomes interactive, right, either is going to report some error, like the framework saying, "Oh, something weird happened," or the hydration is going to try to restore and re-render the original value from JavaScript. So that even becomes it a little bit more complicated to do this kind of tricks at scale. No, that big e-commerce or extremely big websites they try to do. Right, they cannot use these frameworks for these reasons.
Yeah, I think the issue there is that when you do hydration, right, you have a single framework on a page, and the single framework needs a single source of truth. And when you start to do personalization and you say, well, actually, the hero image is this, and the feature products are these, and then the username is this, and shopping cart is this, etc. When you mix it all up, right, you also have to make sure that you correctly set the internal state of the framework so that when it hydrates, it won't mess things up. And that's actually an extremely difficult thing to do. And so because it's so difficult, most people just give up and say, like, forget it. Like, I can't do this. And I think this is the reason why we don't really have good answers right now.
Well, you know what? Also, Oren in the chat beat me to it, but the only framework where I've seen have something similar is Marco here, and I think Marco shares a very similar philosophy that Mishko's been posting about a lot lately, which is basically the fastest code is the code you just never execute. The fastest query is the query you never execute. All of this, yes. Right? So Marco's been a good example of that, of like, do things compile time. I forgot what they call them, that these fragments that are just cached never need to just be touched again. And I think that's the thing, like you guys talked about, the typical framework sees everything as I control everything. The whole page, the whole tree is me. And Quick has this very elegant system, or actually to contrast, there's the islands approach too, which is just like separated applications. There's a lot of complications there, stitching and synchronizing these things though. And it's fascinating to have this sort of like Goldilocks option where everything can be treated as self-contained independently. You have all those properties, all of you just described. You can cache pieces, you can replace pieces, you can personalize pieces, and this extreme diligence to never run code anywhere that doesn't need to run, but still connected and able to speak to each other in a very built-in and natural way. I mean, that's the whole irony of Quick, is taking all of those concepts, which we've seen in Marco, we've seen in Wiz, and just bring them to essentially React style DX, which is an overwhelmingly difficult problem. And Mishko, I see you want to jump in, so please go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of mention that the reason these frameworks like Marco, Wiz, and Quick can do this is because they're resumable, but that in itself is not an obvious explanation as to why. So I think you have to back up a second. And so what resumability requires is that the framework is serializable. The truth of the state of the system is fully serializable into some format. And the answer is obviously HTML. The reason why all these frameworks can do this, right, is because HTML is the source of truth, right? You don't have this world of like, oh, I'm going to change this, but I also have to remember to change the database because that's going to like clobber that thing over there eventually, right? And so if you have a single source of truth, things like this become super, super easy. So that's the reason why Marco can do this. This is why Wiz can do this. This is why Quick can do it. And so my prediction here is that once people understand just like how powerful this mental model is, I think there's going to be a proliferation of gazillion different frameworks, just like there's a lot of frameworks we have today that are in the component box, right? Like, oh, you want a component framework? Like, here's a nice selection for you to choose from. Some prefer JSX, some prefer HTML templating, some prefer, combining code and template together, right? Like, pick your style, all right? And but they're all fundamentally component-based frameworks. And so I think I'm hoping that like once people see the benefits of these resumable frameworks, then they're going to be like, maybe I can improve on this development experience or that development experience or whatever, right? Like, but there is going to be a new class of things that I think is going to happen. Certainly I hope Quick is going to be one of them because it's definitely a pioneer in this area, but it's not, it's not a initial, right? Because, the initial credit I think does go to Marco and does go to Wiz. And I was just actually playing with Wiz, and one of the app with Wiz is Google Photos. And I was just playing with the app, and I was just like, can I get in the situation where I can like navigate to a page and I quickly click on something and I'll have to wait. And with the photos, I just can't get there. Like I was like desperately trying to like click on stuff in the UI to kind of get to this, like there is a delay, and it just doesn't happen. And I recommend people try this on their own. And Wiz is Photos is a crazy complicated application. Like you have gajillion photos to load and kind of process and show up and scroll through, etc. So like it may look trivial, but it's actually a hard thing to do. And so this is the kind of apps that I'm imagining, right? Like the thing I want is, somebody sends you a link on Twitter of like some cool shoes or something that you have to have. And then you should be able to click on it and be like, I'm going to break the site by clicking on it too fast. And you can't do it, right? You fundamentally cannot click fast enough where the site can't keep up. Whereas today, that's trivially easy to do things where the site can't keep up.
Did you figure out how they prefetch Google Photos? Like, did they download it eagerly?
I haven't looked, but I think last time I checked, I believe it's just the eager download. Google Photos doesn't do as much magical stuff as Quick does, but it's you have to keep in mind that Google Photos. That Wiz has been around for at least 5+ years, and so many things like prefetching, etc., didn't exist. Many solutions that they have are probably just historical solutions because that was the only solution back in the day.
Yeah,
I can mention. Malty, the creator of Wiz, was telling me, at least he didn't specify which application, but he said what they found was best for Wiz was as soon as the page loads, they query out what are all the JavaScript URLs, and they put that into one big request. So they, one big query param that's like, here's all the JS URLs I need, and the server will grab, cacaddle those, and send that as one bundle that is eager prefetched, but none of it executed. That's what he said, but we can verify.
That's exactly how it works. That is exactly how it works. And the thing I want to point out is that particular mechanism actually predates module loading, right? So they literally just concatenated strings because when they did this, there wasn't even a module system.
I can
imagine
it was before.
Wiz is weird, but mainly because Wiz is relatively old, right? And many things that exist today didn't exist back then. So it's like you shouldn't look at Wiz and be like, well, that's a dumb way of doing it. Well, yes, but history, right? Go back 10, 15 years, and then you didn't have this. So at the time, this was actually the only solution that they could do.
I can even imagine they didn't even have HTTP2. I remember this trick where you have to download, instead of a lot of small image, you will just have this one single image with a lot
sprites,
of So I think that will be the JavaScript equivalent of that technique. I wanted to kind of connect again when we're talking about how edge friendly, in a way, and the benefits that resumable frameworks bring to the edge also applies to all kinds of workers, right? Like in order to be to work in the edge, you kind of have to be kind of platform agnostic. Like you should not depend on Node or be in a specific way. You should just be like JavaScript, right? And the other thing is that resumability changes the trade-off of the things that make sense. So give me an example. You could run React in a service worker, which happens in your device, right? You could probably figure it out, right? And then push the HTML there, send it to the same machine, basically, right? And then there, the same JavaScript will have to run again, right? And do all the stuff twice in the same computer, right? That's how it will be having React in a service worker, because it's not resumable. You will have to do the same thing twice, and that makes no sense. It's not practical. It's maybe possible, but not practical. I think resumability also changed that, and that's why also we are we have all these ideas of how to use Quick or things like in the edge or even in the service worker, because there is not there's no replay, right? There's no replay of the application in any case. And I think that's super interesting too.
Yeah, and on that point, Manu, I think the really difficult part or thing to kind of realize is React has on-click properties, listeners that get put onto certain JSX nodes. To realize to add that on-click listener to that HTML element, you need to run the renderer. But that's not rendering. That's like something else, right? Like, so like we're so accustomed that they're the same thing, right? You need to add a listener, you need to run the render, but like, is that rendering? I mean, are you making text or you're just assigning a listener to it?
I think in a lot of frameworks, rendering is, I don't know, over, like it's used for everything, right? We realize this house, prop, like when you pass data through props, it's literally using the data, using the render to pass data, with all the
Yes.
overhead of everything, right? And that's also like frameworks that are not even resumable, like Svelte or Solid, just realize that doesn't make sense. Like you don't need to re-render to pass data, right? Like it's just, you don't have to, right?
Yeah. And
And when you realize that a lot of components, right, they are just re-rendering, and you have maybe like 5 components, and all the ones in the middle, they don't have to do anything, but just the fact that you have to render for it to take the value and pass it to the next one and pass it to the next one, and that's huge overhead, right? And this not previous generation, like the latest framework like Solid or Svelte, they already figured it out. I think the next step with resumability is that you don't even have to execute it. Like that's the kind of even the next one. Like, you don't even have to. Like you can serialize everything.
And when we break those apart, so when we don't say like this JSX node represents this HTML element, which we then use to assign an on-click listener, when you break that apart, like to your example of if we were to run into a web worker or a service worker, we no longer have to keep track of like, well, this node equals this node over here. So let's try to, when changes happen, let's keep them in sync. Whereas like we don't have to do that anymore when you kind of split those apart and get the listeners off of the HTML elements.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating topic. So I want to go deeper on this one. You know, there's a couple things I want to make sure we hit on, and I want to make sure we're answering some of these questions live as well for those listening after the fact or whatever too. And to encourage anybody who has questions to sort of please ask. And so one thing we promised is how you can leverage these things. And so to close the loop on sort of leveraging the edge, I would say generally speaking, today, the way you can leverage edge workers, if you're using a traditional framework like a Next.js that needs to be running, you know, on a full set of servers. Now with Vercel investing on the edge, I think that'll change for Next.js, and it is incrementally changing. So we could take an even older framework, but in most cases, edge workers will just do simple rewrites at the edge. They won't render an entire application. You will today get full edge rendering with things like Svelte, Solid.js, and Quick. So the new frameworks are embracing that. I think Remix maybe supports it. So that's a big thing. And that's just building the entire framework in mind that you don't have the Node.js environment. You actually have this subset that's actually, you know, these days often designed after service workers. So I want to get back to service workers in a second, because that's another big topic. But briefly to touch on also a question in the chat, just so we know. The question is, how do you see Quick fitting into enterprise applications? And I can add just a couple little notes on this one too. So I actually think one of Quick's biggest strengths is in enterprise applications, because a lot of the problems of the popular frameworks today are exaggerated with the larger websites and applications. So the first one that's actually becoming quite significant is just the realization that page load times impact your conversion rate so significantly. So there's all these reports that Amazon loses billions of dollars when it takes an extra 100 milliseconds for a page to load. Hydration usually takes longer than that for a lot of applications, because, and getting to the second point, in Amazon.com is going to be incredibly complex. And it's going to have tons of business logic and tons of potential interactivity and tons of areas they want to personalize. So they've just said, we can't run React on the server. It's just too slow. We need to be shooting out responses that are unique to the visitor immediately. We can't hydrate. It's such a complex application this traditional way. It just doesn't work. So a lot of the traditional approaches fall apart at enterprise scale and complexity. And we know it impacts their business in extremely measurable ways. You know, if your job is an engineer at Amazon and you can reduce the boot up speed or increase the response times by 100 milliseconds, you just paid for your own salary times 1,000, right? You save them $1 billion and you don't cost that much. So that's a massive improvement to these sort of enterprises. But I think the last one that we see on the enterprise sort of landscape is micro front ends. This idea that we talked about, how Quick can have this sort of in between sort of a monolith application. It can feel like that. It can behave like islands, but it can have a communication bridge across all the components of the system while still also supporting bringing in components from other frameworks, right? So Quickify your React component. You can have a micro front-end based approach where, let's take Amazon as an example. Amazon could be deploying updates to pieces of their UI using Quick or other frameworks without having these costs of render times, hydration times, and regardless of complexity. So that's a couple of things that I think Quick actually has a really great footing in enterprise. we know from the beginning that any framework is very fast when you just write hello world. So, if you have a personal blog that's got simple content, most frameworks will probably be fast enough, but it's when things get large and complex and businesses have all these departments with all these needs, that's when Quick really starts to separate from the other options and be a big player here. So Mishko, please jump in too.
Yeah, what I was going to jump in is that people talk about performance all the time, right? And it's like every single framework like brags about how fast they are, et cetera, et cetera. And I really want to separate the different kind of performance, right? There is the performance of startup, and then there's the performance of like actually when the application is running and I want to change the number of items in the shopping cart or something like that, or like render the rows, etc. Maybe this is an unpopular opinion here, but I'm going to say like the runtime performance, like while it matters, it's not that big of a deal, because no matter which framework you use, they're all plenty fast. Like, whether you're using React, Angular, Svelte, AngularJS, doesn't matter. They all, at runtime, the application is good enough. Like maybe every once in a while you have to do extra optimization or do some work, but there's always some kind of a latch that allows you to escape and fix this problem.
Could I just add that?
Yeah,
I think what it is it's a solved problem. Is what it is. It's basically
yes.
React, Angular, Vue, you name it. They can re-render extremely fast, and React is kind of known right now as one of the slower renderers, and it's by far the most widely used framework. And so, it is good.
And even that, it depends, right? Because if you are measuring, like React doesn't even focus in the same level of runtime performance. They actually care more about not blocking other things. So that's also important. When we work in Stencil, we have this dilemma or of choosing between having a super high throughput in rendering or actually not blocking animations. So it was actually, if we do tricks to actually not block the main thread and keep CSS animation, we actually hard the actual raw numbers of performance. So even rendering in practice, the runtime performance is super hard, and different frameworks choose different trade-offs in this sense, right? So React is slow, but depend also how you measure it, right?
It's also worth quickly noting too, like I mentioned, I was at the Solid.js meetup, and they distinctly found that you can destroy the performance of any other framework. Doesn't mean people are rushing to adopt you, right? Now, Solid is getting adopted, but it's not what people are looking for. Nobody's saying my runtime performance is not good enough, and so I need to switch my frameworks at this moment.
Right. So the only point I wanted to make is that when we talk about performance, we're talking about a different kind of performance, right? And specifically, we're talking about a startup performance. And when you see benchmarks everywhere claiming we're the fastest, usually what they mean is the runtime performance, which, as we point out, it's nice, but it's not really the thing that is, losing your business millions.
I think also, I think it's related to the question of enterprise. The resumability as a concept, as a word, might be new, right? But as a concept, it's not. Like as Mishko said, it's been using this kind of technique, maybe with a different name or whatever, but it's been using this for, I don't know, 6 years or whatever, right? And I think what I find extremely interesting is that, or maybe Amazon, they have their custom stuff that is kind of resumable in a way. And I think the very interesting thing is that the resumable frameworks are trying to bring what this super end use cases like Google search or Google Force to more like everyone, right? Because that still needs the value, right? Because now Quick has a super nice developer experience. Like if you wanted to do the other thing, you will have to kind of write your server in Java, wire things up manually. That will be not practical. I think new frameworks that they bring this resumability concept, they kind of make this much easier. So a lot of more companies and a lot of more developers are going to start doing this because it will just make sense, right?
Yeah, and I think to back that up is another thing that React brought was fast rendering, right? So you think of VDOM, fast rendering, and that was a big push. But the other thing I think it brought, and really more recently, is the DX side of things. React ecosystem has made developing a lot easier, and so has in Vue and Svelte and Angular and all that. So I think that's the other thing is right, we can build this Amazon to scale framework, but that's just not going to have the DX of what React is, and that's what we're trying to do with Quick.
Exactly. So next thing I want to jump into, because as promised, we mentioned web workers and service workers. We talked about edge workers or computing on completely different machines than your machine, you being the requester of a web page, application, or whatever. But you actually do have two options to run code on another process, or you call it another thread, on the local device. And you have service workers, and you have web workers. And again, to the promise of the stream, we want to talk about, what can you do today to leverage those to increase the speed of your application, as well as sort of what's coming on the horizon. And I think what we start touching on, the fascinating thing about Quick not needing to replay code, means you can have a server and a service worker spitting HTML to the main thread. You could actually, in theory, have an entire application you're running locally that is not doing any computation for the most part on the main thread. It's a server. And that's part of the beauty too of these new edge runtimes pushing us in the direction of like standard interfaces that can run on your device or anything else. Mishka, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just laughing here because you're like, in theory. It's like, what do you mean in theory? Like when you go to the tutorial on a Quick homepage, the actual thing gets rendered in a service worker. So this isn't theory. This is actually how the tutorials work inside of Quick.
Yeah, I guess I more mean, for instance, you could say in theory, you could run your application in a web container. Doesn't mean it's a good idea. A good idea for a tutorial website, not a good idea for a real world website. So I think the interesting thing for us to explore, but I do want to start with a little bit of preamble from Adam, is sort of when, where, how on this stuff. I think, so Mishko, I want to hear your thoughts. And then Adam, I think I want to hear a little bit about like, what is a web worker? What's a service worker? When do we use them differently? But Mishko, please jump in first.
I was just going to derail the conversation very, very slightly, and I promise to bring it back in, which is that CPUs are getting faster, but they're not really getting faster. And I think it's worth discussing this, which is that the basic problem with CPUs is that we have kind of reached the maximum clock speed, right? And then you can say like, well, clock speed's not everything. That's true. And so we got really good at like breaking down our processing of the pipeline so that we can do a bajillion things on a per clock cycle. But that also kind of reached the limit as well. And so we're in this world where for the past, I don't know, like 5 years, like CPUs haven't really gone faster on a core level. I mean, yes, they have, but they haven't really, right? Instead, all the performance what we've been seeing from CPUs lately is about the fact that like now when you buy a CPU, it's not a single core, it's 6, 8, 16, 30, whatever, like craziness, right? Now you have a CPU that has like performance cores and it has a battery performance, I guess that's another way of looking at performance core, and so on, and so you can switch, right? And so the problem is because the speed of individual cores have kind of stalled, this doesn't really work well for JavaScript because JavaScript is single-threaded, and we haven't had a good way of figuring out how to make it multi-threaded. And so the reason why this discussion is important about thread workers, etc., is because there actually are separate threads, right? So this is our chance in a JavaScript community to kind of figure out, like, we have these modern phones with modern multiple core CPUs. How do we take advantage of these multiple cores? Because if everything's running on the main thread, it's all running in a single core, and that's not helping. So with that preamble, I'm going to hand it over to Adam.
Yeah, it is it's a lot of fun to think about of like, we've always had this traditional, the browser, the main thread, there is JavaScript is single threaded. Everyone's, talks about single thread. There's only so much you can do. You should do things async, but it's still all on the same thread. And exactly what you're saying, Mishko, is like, we only can go so far with that. And that's why it's cool to think about, web workers, which have been around since, I think they've been practical to use since like IE 10. So they've been around for quite a while. But again, back to kind of like the traditional framework, they're wiring up DOM nodes and listeners. And so if we run the entire framework inside of a web worker, then how does it know when it says to update the DOM? How does it know which node are you talking about? What if it gets out of sync? And so the jump between the two is just too slow. And I've read, I've attempted it myself. It's just too slow to try to have a framework in the web worker to communicate with the main thread, because of the listeners is what it comes down to. And then knowing this map of nodes and things like that. And so with Quick, what's really, really cool is again, the idea of, because it's resumable, because really we're just able to take a string, which is HTML, but it's a string sitting somewhere else. And it's able to stay in sync with the actual application that would be in the web worker, because it's not wired up directly to it. It rather just knows how to react to after a button is clicked or something like that, or lack thereof. So it doesn't need to have this one-for-one post-message async hop between the two. And that's probably where we can talk about PartyTown too, right? And it's our other project.
Could you also, yeah, and I think it's the right time. And I also, workers have been around forever, but nobody's been using them, especially web workers, a bit of service workers. Service workers more for caching. There was this whole idea of push notifications to service workers. I don't know if I see that in practice. Wait, Mono's saying yes. Go ahead.
No, I was thinking that some months ago we built this demo where we cannot build application 3 times. So we build for the Cloudflare, the client build, and service worker build. The service worker build basically will just have the event listen, the cache, the request, right? So when you actually went to the website, the first request, right, you don't have the service worker. So the request will go to Cloudflare Edge, whatever, right? And it will respond with the HTML, and you have it there. But the second, and that will be an HTML that at the end will have the service worker registration, right? So the next refresh, right, you will see that first of all the application is offline, and you get a fully HTML that didn't render in the service worker that you just register with a different value or something. It was super cool to see this as well.
Well, so that's also a good example. Yeah, no, that's like a good example of one pre-limited question I want to ask Adam, which is, again, these workers have been around forever. I will be honest, I've been writing web developing for an eternity, it feels like at this point, and I have barely touched those things. And if you ask me what's the difference between a web worker and service worker in detail, I could give you some shallow answers, but I'm like, the nuances, I can't necessarily answer for you. So Adam, could you give us a little rundown, like the difference between web worker, service worker, what each is useful for? And then we can talk about what PartyTown's doing, what we're exploring with Quick, like what are you going to do with these things now?
Yeah, so yeah, the web worker is kind of the core primitive of like, I can create a new worker and it creates this instance somewhere else in another thread. I can then send messages to it asynchronously by doing a post message. I can listen for its responses and go back and forth. And that's like very low level, baked into the browser of how it works. So service workers are actually built on top of this whole concept. It's a little bit more limited web worker, but really in the whole grand scheme of things, it's another web worker that has the same benefits if it's running in a different thread, not affecting the UI. But then the service worker has some additional things of being able to, like, it has to run on the same origin. It's able to intercept requests. It's able to, pre-cache a bunch of requests that you were probably going to need. And so there's a whole nother, I guess, side of what service workers can do, especially for like PWAs and having it all work offline. But the reason it's able to do that is because it's built on top of a web worker and how it communicates.
And it has what extra property that relates to that, right? Where they can outlive your session, or they can if I remember right, but you tell me, a web worker, if I refresh my page, web worker goes away, a standard web worker, I'm going to have to respawn a new one. Service worker can outlive my page refreshes. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah. And I don't know. Yes. So you have you can activate one and it like stays there for a while. And then there's a whole, debate of like, when does it shut down? When do you restart it? Or when you get a new update, how do you update that? And that's a whole nother service worker, thing that needs to be figured out by the developer. It has its own issues. That's why stuff like Workbox is a great, is it Workbox? I think it's Workbox is a great project that can help out with those things. But yeah, for the most part, it's you're able to start a new instance and it's kind of just stays there. So that if you were on the subway, you had no network, you can then decide what to do if you try to request something and there is no network. Then that's where the service worker is like, oh, I know what to do. And it responds with some cached version it already has.
Adam, will you say that service worker is the smallest, most complicated API you ever use?
Yes, you knew I was waiting for you to bug me on that. Yes, I find it very difficult to use because it's a very challenging problem, right? It's how do you run code that when you're not connected to the network at all, and how do you know when to redo it? Like the hardest part is like the caching of a service worker. It's one thing to download, this is the app that's going to work offline forever, But then like, yeah, but I want to update that app tomorrow. Like, so how do we know to like update this app that should never know, that should be able to work offline? And I think those APIs are very tricky and difficult to use just natively. But I mean, that's a whole nother web development topic.
Well, I remember Create React app for a little while was playing with auto-installing a service worker. And this was back in the day too, where the world seemed to go towards single page applications and everybody's like, well, slow. It's like, well, we'll just save it like a native app. It'll just be there on your device. So when you reload it, you can be offline. You don't have to re-download it all. And there was these kind of contorted directions it kind of went. And I remember Create React app, for a little while, it would start with a service worker installation. And it would kind of have some notes of like, you may not want this, but maybe, I remember being very like indecisive about it.
Yeah.
All I remember that manifested to me as a developer is I would have these sticky cache problems I couldn't debug. I was just like, why is it not updating? It would drive me insane. And I remember you go on Stack Overflow and everybody's just like, get rid of the service worker, comment it out, bad idea. And it was just, I guess it's just a hard problem. It was a very annoying problem. Service workers for caching is definitely hit and miss in certain regards in my experience. But I think that's sort of, you kind of pointed out what I think one of the biggest things that kept web workers from being useful for a long time too is web workers, the ergonomics of them is just, it seems like a simple concept. Take some code, run somewhere else, send messages. But it turns out for just a normal application development workflow, that those ergonomics are horrible. Like, I think the only real use case I saw that I could point to was some people would run, VS Code would run sort of the actual TypeScript compiler actually as like a server, like language server protocol, right? So it would run in a worker style thing and then post updates of like, what should the IDE suggest or warn or whatever. And that worked quite well because you have these very distinctly different self-contained processes to run, the UI of the IDE and then the language server that's looking at files, analyzing and sending messages back up. But that's exactly the problem that Partytown solves, right? It's like, hey, how do we fix the ergonomic issues here? And it's just probably a good segue. Like Adam, like curious your thoughts, leveraging web workers today, they've been is systemically under leveraged. Now we have quite an easy way to leverage it. Like, what is your opinions about sort of, who should be using Partytown now? Where is it going? Should we run our React apps in Partytown? The number one question. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, right. So back to like the ergonomics of web workers, they really have always been like, if you've got a CPU intensive thing, like you have to calculate something and it returns a number, like that's a great example of what web workers would be for, especially if it's asynchronous. And so in another project, Comlink, which is a great one for that really helps figure this all out. So if, again, you have a function that takes forever, run it somewhere else, get the response from it. Where that breaks down and where that doesn't work is when you start doing DOM operations, when you start doing document.title or element.get attribute, things like that. When you run that code, the web worker or service worker, whatever you're in, it's going to be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. What is a document? What is a window? What's add, like all these different things. And so that's where Partytown comes in. And so Partytown is another one of our projects that kind of helps handle this part, where it's able to pretty much, it's a fancy proxy. It's a way to proxy the window or document that do not exist in that environment. And so that when a command to document.title is called, it knows to then say like, I don't know what you mean, but let's run the same code over into the main thread. Let's see what the main thread says it is and return back to this thread. And so by doing that, that allows the web worker to actually to have all the memory for that script, to download that script, to make all the different like pings to their services in that web worker into a different thread. So all that heavy lifting that the third parties, so some other script might be doing, can happen into a different thread. And you can even say that it's a feature that you're going to be slowing down some of this code in this web worker rather than trying to have it hit the main thread heavily. And so that's the big difference. And so like to your next question is, like what type of code should run inside of Partytown? And so you're thinking like, okay, so if it's great to run everything into a web worker, why don't I just run my React app and Angular app inside of Partytown too? And that's where it's the fast follow-up is like, well, no, the main thread is for your code to run as fast as possible. It's the code that we want to run in kind of a background process to run a little bit slower. That would be the third-party scripts. And those are actually the biggest culprits of what is slowest, because they, on a good day, a third-party script is 300 kilobytes. And then normally a site, I think I actually looked it up on the HTTP archive. The median for third-party scripts is 10. the 90th percentile for third-party scripts is 34 scripts on a web page. So a lot of sites have a lot of third-party scripts, and this is code that you can't control. It's code that you can't say like, well, I want to not have this because it's just too slow, because it's kind of out of your call, right? It's the organizational decision of we need to have this data collected so that we can go to this department, and the department can decide what to do with that data. And so to just say, well, let's not have third-party scripts is not a fair one, because again, it's out of your control. So it's kind of up to you as a developer. It's like, well, how can we still have a high-performing site, still collect this data, but not affect my main application? And that's kind of where Partytown comes in, is that you're able to dedicate the main thread to your application, and then all these other mini applications that are fighting for resources and doing layout thrashing are kind of throttled into the web worker.
I have a bit of a left, or you go ahead, Manu, then I'll ask my question.
No, this reminds me to a blog post I read some months ago about why the M1 CPUs were faster, and the article was the M1 processors that are fast in many different ways, but mostly the most important one is the quality of service. And this article explained how Apple does such a good job to schedule the jobs, like background jobs and like important things and interactive time-aware tasks that need to be completed very fast in a very smart way that other operating system doesn't do, that it gives you this impression of, wow, this is super fast, right? And I think Partytown is about that quality of service. It doesn't mean that the code, we can do magic, right? Well, it's a very magic project, right? It has a lot of magic, but we cannot do magic. Like the job needs to be done. And probably the fact that there is this proxy, there is an overhead. So it's probably going to be slower. But the difference is that you don't care, right? You don't care if this Google Analytics doesn't run with all the power of your computer. Right? You actually don't want to do that. You actually want to say, this is not important. Just put it there, right? And I think that quality of service is where the value of Partytown is, and I think it connects really well with how M1 or Apple products work.
Yeah, and another thing that like we don't have controls over as JavaScript developers is once you're on the main thread or once you're executing, just everybody just fights for, let's say, execute as fast as possible, and that goes for whether it's your code or whether it's the 34 other third-party script code executing at the same time, and so they're all fighting. I can't say that mine has a higher priority than these other 34. You're just 35 scripts that are running at the same time.
Yeah. And so, you reminded me of one other thing. I have a weird left field question about this. So one thing that has been asked a few times is, and I think this goes back to sort of this idea of these monolithic applications, one centralized application taking over your entire browser versus breaking it apart in this sort of seamless way Quick does. Again, not hard islands and not like one giant thing. You can actually have some in between, almost like hybrid options. So one thing that came up with Partytown a lot is people talking about NG modules or Angular services. I just want to I want to seamlessly run one of my services over in the worker and use Partytown to make the bridge quite easy. Now, the problem with that, of course, is the way these Angular services and modules work is very synchronous, right? They're provided into your constructor. You access everything synchronously. Now, what's interesting to me, and this is a completely unplanned question that just purely came to mind, is Quick embraces that everything's asynchronous. When you write $signs in Quick, that means that's an asynchronous boundary. For the most part, you don't have to worry about that. But one thing that you'll see is if you have a prop for a component that takes a function as the prop value, like a closure, that actually needs to be asynchronous, and you call that asynchronously because those functions passed down have the $sign, they're a lazy loading boundary, you get a wild amount of benefits. And, it's interesting to think about potential futures for Partytown, where today it's very much this idea that you have these completely separate scripts with the window variables being the communication bridge, the very old school style. I wonder if like the more asynchronous driven approach, like Quick tags, makes it easier to, in general, we know it lets us compartmentalize and run pieces of our application in different places. Some came from the edge, some was cached from the server, some's in the service worker, right? Can we even shoot off some logic to the web worker through Partytown or other means? I'm curious if anyone has opinions on this because it's kind of just popping into my head and making me think. I'm not sure how you all are reacting to it too.
Yeah, I think that it would have to continue to be kind of the old school, put some function on window and call that that function and expect the response. If it has to be a blocking synchronous task, I think is what Party Town could do. But actually, I'm going to take that back, because you're sitting on the main thread and you want to have a blocking task to go back and forth. So from main to the web worker, we really can't do that. We can't make it blocking in that direction. In the opposite direction, you can, because you can freeze the web worker for a moment to get that information, which is fine, because the web worker can take its time and be a little bit slower and be frozen for a millisecond. But that's not blocking. But if we tried to block it in the UI thread, that's where it would freeze. And that's why like synchronous XHR is deprecated and highly discouraged, and has been for 20 years now. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, other than like Comlink would be the best example of like, integrating. If you do have like, calculating the Fibonacci sequence, use Comlink to do that, post this information, calculate it on the web worker, and then get the information back. And I think Comlink is always starting and stopping on web worker, but I'm not positive on that.
Yeah, actually, I found Comlink for that type of use case, a very self-contained, expensive thing to run in a thread, does work pretty nice. And from the start that you're just using async await to access that. I used a Webpack plugin to make that easier. And it turns out the Webpack plugin had like massive memory leak issues and no maintenance and like a billion other problems. So that was a fun thing we dealt with our builder application. We actually forked it, improved some stuff, actually merged in PRs that people weren't merging. I should double check that. That might actually have some of its own traction of people using it. But anyway, though, I'm happy we were able to get through, I believe we got through all the questions like happened in the chat. We got through our topics on discussing sort of these areas, sort of how you can use these things and optimize your site performance, and where we're exploring things in the future. So I think we could wrap it here. Appreciate everybody who jumped in to ask questions in the chat. It's always extremely valuable. When we don't get to certain topics, it gives us a really good idea for our future topics. And we'll be back here next week, same time, same place. We will come up with a new topic in the next few days, and we're going to start pulling in guests. We keep talking about bringing Ryan from Solid in. He's just our favorite person in the world, especially when it comes to performance expertise. So we'll be roping him in potentially next week or sometime soon. So thank you all for joining. We will catch you next time. See y'all.
Ciao, ciao.